Now I will start the lecture 4, Introduction to Training, part 4, in which basically we will understand the difference between the training, education, development and learners, that is how learners they learn and principles of learning is applicable. Now what we understand by the training? The process of the providing employees with the specific skills or helping them to correct deficiencies in their performance. So therefore either it is the beginning stage of a learner, that is the what he wants to learn, and then specific skills are to be provided to him, so he learns those specific skills, or helping them to correct the deficiencies, that is if they in the present job, as I have mentioned in the session 3, that if there is a present job is there is a next level job and there is a future job, and if this type of the issues are there, then definitely in that case the person requires certain more knowledge, skill, attitude and habits, and then for that purpose they will require to correct the deficiencies, and if these deficiencies are to be corrected, that is only possible if we provide them the training. Training sometimes is taken as a similar to the development. In what context? That is, it provides new skills for the employee. So, naturally there is a development of the employee, keeps the employees up to date with changes in the field, like especially in the case of the technology development, technology management, making the new technology or buying the technology, how to evaluate the technology, how to learn the technology, how to forecast the technology, and then all these things are to be developed with the help of the training programs are there. If we talk about the present job, then its aims is to improve the efficiency of the employee, right. Nowadays when we talk about the Six Sigma concepts, we want to make the best product, best services, then definitely in that case it becomes important to improve the efficiency of the employees, and can be external or the in-house development, and therefore sometimes it is required at the own host organization, sometimes it is required at the client's place also, and therefore it will be, that is the how this particular type of similarity of the development is there. If we see the concept wise the training, it is the job specific skills required, it is the knowledge is required, attitude is required, values are required and orientation is required. However, in the further classes I will also mention a development of the model that talks about knowledge, attitude, skill and habits also, that is the particular job that requires a particular habit. If you have that particular habit, only in that case you can develop that particular type of the aspects of the training is there. Now what is education? Institutional process and formal qualifications are major contributor to personal development, character, culture, aspiration and achievement is there. So therefore it question arises that it is not only the institutional process and formal qualifications, rather than it is the major contributor to the personal development, right. And then education that develops the individual's persons, education also develops the character, education also helps to adopt the culture, it also helps the aspiration and achievement in the life the person is having, and for that purpose he is required a further education. If he is properly educated, then definitely he can be developed. Then direct and indirect enhancement of knowledge and ability is there. In that case definitely there will be a possibility of total possibility of the enhancement of the knowledge and ability, it has to be there. If person is educated, education facilitated to him with the enhancement, it will be maybe it is directly with the when we talk about through the qualifications, or it can be through the process also, and therefore in that case his knowledge and ability has been developed. Now development, it is the primary process that is in the case of the primary process positive or negative developmental process, individual and organizations can be there, adaptation can be there, become more complex, elaborated, settled, aware, differentiated and autonomous child, that can be also part of the development. Now, as we were given the earlier definitions, one more aspect of the training is operational competence. In operational competence, whatever the job is to be done by the individual, aggregate of these knowledge, understanding, skills and personal orientation in a situation at a standard or level of performance, that is also very much important or required is there. So, therefore, whenever we talk about the what is training, in the training we talk about that is the it has to be provide this particular organizational competence is to be there. Second is what product, service, procedural and system knowledge is adopted by that particular during the training is there. Now, the training is given for that particular product development is there. If there is a particular development process, then definitely in that case also the person can enhance that particular skill and develop a product more efficiently, more effectively, more qualitatively, or it can be a new product development also. So, that is also possible. If it is a service, then also the training provides how to provide the better services. Whenever we talk about the service industries, and then in service industries also the better services are provided. Sometimes we talk about the procedural and system knowledge training, that is the one particular procedure is to be followed. For example, ISO 9000, if you want to develop the product in through the ISO 9000 process, then definitely that has to be the procedural has to be there. Sometimes it is the system knowledge, that is the developing that particular system, and then it has to be developed in such a way that is the person is more perfect in system development. He is more better in the development of the systems, and therefore, in that case it becomes very important, that is the system development will be there. Now, whenever we talk about the task and situation specific, then it has to be there, that is to reduce double sided and stapled photocopying is there, and here you will find that is whatever the task is there, it should not be having the multiple tasking unless and until it is very essential that task is to be reduced. Once we provide that particular training, that skill is there, the person may make the best use of the training and reduce the multiple tasking system which was not essential. It can also help the double sided and staple photocopying is there. This type of these photo skills are also that can be developed. So, therefore, in that case the person can be more effective. Second is aircraft emergency landing is one example has been given. Recruitment interviewing, that is also the skill which is required, there is a situation specific training will be given. Then gallstone removal is given, the gallstone removal that can be also the particular skill that can be developed, and the desert survival, that is a house. For all this purpose we are having the different business games also and the case studies, and with the help of the business games and case studies in the session of technique and tools I will be discussing. It means that open and close competencies plus pre and core requisites that is to be provided into the training. If we provide this type of the training, then definitely the person will be more efficient and effective is there. Now, what are the benefits of the education is there? Open capacities may include the task specific is there. So, therefore, does it open the task specific? Yes, it opens the task specific is there. So, open capacities are developed by the particular individual, and as a result of which through the education we can develop the capacities of the individual to perform, ability to perform. Another benefit of the education is that is the knowledge. Yes, whenever we go through the formal education system or even informal education system, we find that is the person is able to enhance his knowledge level 1 km, 2 km, 3 km, 4 km, 5 highest level of knowledge that can be achieved. Earlier I have mentioned that is when you enhance the knowledge, then the data information knowledge into wisdom. So, therefore, in that case the wisdom will be there. Through education it is expected because you are enhancing the knowledge, your decision making process, that will be supported by your wisdom, and therefore, if the wisdom is supported educational system is there, then definitely that will be more in demand and more useful and more beneficiary to the individual. This can be related to the physical, it can be related to the conceptual, it can be related to the procedural, and it can be related to the social knowledge, and therefore, in that case different types of the knowledge and skills and capacity development that can be enhanced. Now, what is most important, and that is the personal orientation. Education is give you a vision, education gives us the particular orientation to grow, to growth, to contribute to the society, to enhance the individual's ability and competencies, to make the wise decisions. All these aspects they are supported by the education is there. The next benefit of the education is that is it trains us to make the analysis, it helps us to develop the problem solving, it helps us the bridging the concepts and practice, because like for example, professional courses, in professional courses like MBA is one side giving you the knowledge, while the other side it through the summer training, winter training, all these type of the training programs, they are making the bridging the concepts and practices also is there. So, education is more powerful, more strong instrument in developing the concepts. Does it provide the standards and level of performance? Yes, it provides the standards and level of performance also, enhances the standards and level of performance is there. It asks us to do the performance in a systematic way and in a better way. It is also develops the level of products, services, procedural and system know-how. Most of the technologies, right, most of the jobs they are depending on not on the man who is standing behind the machine, it is the know-how level of that particular man. You can get the best work done from that particular machine if you are better into the know-how system. If you are better into the know-how system, you can develop that particular skills. Now, the part 2 in the education system is how it is developed. When we talk about the course curriculum development, recently I have taken one project from the ICSSR which is talking about the management education in technical institutes, and in this particular project we are developing the course curriculum which will be specified. As all of you must be knowing, that is the management education in the technical institutes like the IITs, NITs, NITI, IIITM. So, they are required, they are having the different course curriculum, and that making them the more enabled technological oriented managers. So, this technology management course design, that curriculum and the schools and universities level of the quality, that will make a difference, that is the how the education has been provided. Basic fundamental of the for providing the education is developing the citizenship for the country and citizenship for the organization also, and that is for the organizational citizenship behavior, OCB is there. If we talk about the OCB, organizational citizenship behavior, what is citizenship? Citizenship means when we talk about citizenship, we talk about the duties and rights, fundamental rights and fundamental duties. Most of us may be aware about our fundamental rights, but may not be all fundamental duties, right. So, education educates us to make the aware about not only about our rights, but also about our duties. When we talk about the OCB, organizational citizenship behavior, in organizational citizenship behavior, it is the fundamental rights and fundamental duties to be followed in the charter of that particular organization. If you are working into the organization X, then your citizenship behavior is different. It is supposed to be different. It is expected to be different. When you are working into the organization Y of the different management, then definitely the citizenship behavior is expected to be different. Your fundamental rights will be different. The fundamental duties, expected fundamental duties, that will be different. And therefore, what makes the education? Education educates us to know in the X organization what is the fundamental duty, and in the Y organization what is the fundamental duty, what is the difference is there, similarly for the rights also. So, therefore, education makes us the more successful by knowing about the citizenship behavior. Second aspect of the education is for the occupational success. For example, when we talk about the management education, in management education the different specialization, finance, marketing, HR, operations, IT, and therefore, whatever the occupation you adopt, that is why even the experienced people, they come to the to study these business management courses, because they understand that is this type of management education that will enhance their occupational success, it will increase their competency, it will increase their output, and therefore, in that case, that occupational success, for occupational success also education plays a very important role. Education not only the professionally, but also enhances the personal development and life, and therefore, in that case the personal development of an individual, if he is highly educated, we can say that he is the highly educated. However, this is also true that he is the not necessarily highly educated person will be highly learned, but this is expected that he is the highly educated person will be highly learned also, and then he will lead his life, and if a person is educated, his lifestyle and the way to look towards the lifestyle, that will be totally different. Who provides the education? We know that is the school, college, universities, communities, or the adult education is there, and therefore, this type of the evening classes are there for the educate. So, therefore, this type of the Proud Shiksha and all that is there, or public attitudes, the revalue of education. Now, many times there are the criticisms for the education, that is the person is educated but not learned, as I mentioned, and that if this type of the public reaction is there, so one has to see into the course curriculum. Is the course curriculum is not properly designed, is the course curriculum is not properly structured? If it is so, then in that case there is a need for change. Because we cannot undermine the education, but we can understand the difference between the educational contents and the practical requirement, and if there is a wide gap, then education will not be useful. So, therefore, it is not that the education is not useful, it is the whatever the knowledge has been imbibed in that particular learner, that particular learner is not able to develop that particular skills which knowledge that is required to be performed at the workplace or in the society, even may not be the workplace, but at the society, because the educated person should contribute toward the society also. Many times the education also help in the government, in the functioning of the government, in the developing the systems, procedures, or to the helping to the employer in the industries, and also able to fulfill the individual responsibility more specifically, more objectively, more purposefully. Education is not an ending process, education is the lifelong learning is there, right. So, a person can be educated at whatever any age is there, it does not depend on the age, and person can get educated with the further period of time of his life also. So, whenever we talk about these particular learning process, the responsiveness is concerned, the reactions is concerned, and rights are concerned, 3 R's are concerned, we will talk about that is the how access to learning is there. So, it is a scientific and philosophical rigor. Education gives you a temperament, a scientific temperament is there. What is a scientific temperament? That is a logic based temperament is there. Whatever you will do, you will follow. If a person is educated, he will do any particular act, his decision making process, his participation in the society, that will make a scientific and philosophical rigor will be there. He will not do which is not required, he will not do which will damage the society, and therefore, in that case there will be a scientific and the philosophical rigor will be there whenever there will be the proper education, appropriate education is there. Education is critically evaluation, it helps us to evaluate any concept. Critically means it does not mean the criticism, critically means that to understand, like for example we teach about the SWOT analysis. strength, weakness, opportunities and threats. The SWOT is also a critical method. It helps us an individual, that is the identify what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, what is strength, what is weakness, and it also informs us about the future, the positivity of the future like opportunities, or negativity of the future, that is about the threats, what threats are coming. So, therefore, an education provides us the capability to make the critical evaluation. Education also help us to develop the complex synthesis. The complex synthesis is that is the, if there are so many dimensions are there and all the points are to be connected and network is to be created, and then an educated person will be with his competency, with his education will be able to develop that complex synthesis also, that is he will not be leave any node unconnected. So, therefore, in that case it becomes very important, that is the education develops us to connect with the society, connect with the people, connect with the organization, connect with the environment, right. So, therefore, in that case that complex synthesis that he can develop, educated person can develop. If somebody asks, that is why you have done so, and then he will be an educated person will be able to tell analytical explanation. Education helps us to make the proper analysis and giving the right explanation on the basis of that analysis is there, because his mind is trained, that is the how to approach to the problem. If there is a problem, then what assumptions he is supposed to make, and on basis of the assumptions he has to work on that. Whatever the results are there, analytical results are there, he will make the explanations for that. So, therefore, in that case a particular person, an educated person, he is strong enough to make the analytical explanations. Similarly, an educated person will be having the technical application. Technical application means that is a person is able to use the make the use of the technology. If the technological use is there, then definitely in that case he will be developing himself that what analytical problems, he will be able to identify the use of the technology and then making the complex synthesis, he will be developing the critical evaluation, all these aspects will be there and then technical applications will be there. Now, a person will be also, educated person will be also able to make the contextual understanding. It is a wonderful point, that is the, if the understanding is required, an educated person will be able to understand in what context this particular output is there. Connecting this particular context, making the implication of the understanding the implication of this context, then whatever decision is there, what will be the impact of that particular decision, that context. Therefore, this type of the contextual understanding that will be developed by the particular individual. So, there in the case of the educated person, it will be descriptive knowledge. It will not only subjective, that is he is restricted, it will be always descriptive knowledge he will be developing, he will be connecting the different areas, he will be multi-skilled, he will be multidimensional, he will be more explanatory, and therefore, this will be making the descriptive knowledge, as a result of which he will be able to categorization. There are different categories are there, whether the managerial, technological or techno-managerial, all these aspects that the person will be able to develop, and as a result of which he will, an educated person will be having the categorization. So, he will be more reactive, responsive and replyful for the scientific philosophical rigor, critical evaluation, complex synthesis, analytical explanations, technical applications, contextual understanding educated person, and the descriptive knowledge and the categorization, that access to learning will be there. Now, the next part comes, that is the training and development. So, after the business education training, then education, and now we will talk about the training and development, right. So, whenever we are talking about the program and the task focused learning is there, right. So, therefore, already the basic skills are known. So, person is trained, but the development needs of the employees, that is the what type of the individual or the group is required to develop. It has to be, point number 2 has to be connect with the point number 1, that is the whatever the program and task focused learning is there. it depends on what? It depends on the future jobs. Whatever the future jobs are needed, on basis of that this development needs of the employees for the group and individual, that will be developed. If that is applicable, then definitely there will be technical and management development in the organization. If manpower of the organization, human resource of the organization, that is properly trained, properly developed, so then definitely in that case that particular organization, that has to be technically and managerially has to be developed. Then it will be self managed learning and career management, a wonderful point. That is this type of the business training and development that will help the managing the self management training will be there. Like I was talking about the emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman, that is a self awareness and self regulation. So, if that type of the understanding is there, then definitely the person will be able to manage himself very well. It is expected because he is trained, he is educated, he is in the path of development, and therefore, it is expected that he will manage himself very well, and not only in the personal life, but it also will be helping into the career management, that is for his professional growth, professional development, for professional understanding, and then in that case it will be very much clear that is the self management learning and the career management, both aspects will go with the development is there, and the period of time the person will go ahead in the career, he will achieve the high positions, high respect, high recognition. There is one more terminology here, and that is of the learning organizations. Now you see that is with the, as I mentioned, social, political, economical, legal, technological environment is keep on changing. Organizations have to respond that. If organizations have to respond that, organizations themselves have to learn, that is what is going on, and that is called the learning organizations are there. Learning organizations, they keep always an eye on the society, they keep on understanding of the law, they keep on understanding of the environment, and then accordingly they change themselves. Earlier many organizations, they were not very proactive. Now many organizations are becoming proactive because they are getting educated and developed. Now many organizations, they are learning, that is the, if you want to make the growth in the business market, you have to adopt the technology. Many organizations are learning, that is the professional requirement of the manpower is very much essential. If you do not have the professional, then it will take time to give the results. So therefore in that case, this learning organizations, that becomes very important is there. Another aspect is the knowledge management. What is knowledge management? According to the Wendy Ruth, there are 7 steps in the knowledge management. How do you get? How do you use? How do you learn? How do you contribute? How you build and sustain? How do you assess? And how do you divest? These are the 7 points are there in the knowledge management. So therefore in that case, the source, get means source. How do you get that particular knowledge? What is the source of your knowledge? If your source of your knowledge is very strong, very much authenticate, very much fruitful, very much realistic, then definitely you will get the best training, education and development practice coaching. Second is, are you getting an opportunity to use it? Because one may be highly qualified, but and trained and skill developed, but is he getting the opportunity to use it? And then if he is using that, is he learning from that? Step number 3, that is the, if you are making an experience, are you learning from your experience? If you are learning from your experience, we are the learned person. Then whatever you learn, you do not restrict to yourself in the organization, you contribute. You contribute to your colleagues, you contribute to your subordinates, and as a result of which the whole organization, that is the learning organization, and the learning organization is becoming the knowledge based organization. If you contribute, the organization build and sustain on that particular aspect, that is the, if that organization is contributing, then that organization will be making the building and sustainability is there, and if they are building and sustainable, then definitely they are making long life. So therefore build and sustain is there, but how long it will continue? Then in knowledge management you have to make the assessment periodically, time to time, and it depends on the life cycle of the product, and then you have to understand, that is the, you have to get, use, learn and contribute, build and sustain, and then again assess, and finally on these cycles you will make the divest to the society. So, you will be making the useful to the society. So, all these education, training and development, they make the learning organizations, they make the learning society also, and then they make the use of the principles of the knowledge management. In this slide, the last point is organization culture and HRM levers for change. Examples are shifts in attitudes and the beliefs is there. Now, the organizational culture, we know that is the Professor Uday Parikh has given the octopus. So, therefore, whatever type of the openness you are having, whatever type of the confrontation is there in the organization, whatever type of the authenticity is there, whatever type of the trust is there. So, trust is becoming very, very important. Is the organization is proactive, is there is an authority is there, is the organization is the research oriented, is experimental. So, therefore, in that case this type of the organization culture and HRM levers for the change, that is shifts in attitude and beliefs as well as in the behavior, that becomes very, very important. All these practices that will make an organization more skillful, more knowledgeable and the more developed will be there. So, from these training objectives to the effective learning through the training, learning, education, and then we talk about what are the learning principles are there. This is very, very important, whether it is a training or development or it is education, these particular learning principles are to be adopted for making the more and more soundful this particular training, education and development. First is participation. Whether it is a training or education or it is the development practices, what is required is the participation of the employees, participation of the people, participation of the society is becoming very, very important. Unless and until there is not enough participation, then there will not be the any chance that is the any society will grow. So, what makes an important is that is the how to encourage the participation. If we really want to build the nation, we want to build the society, it is the encouraging of the participation that becomes very, very important. Otherwise, many segments and the pockets of the society that will not be developed. So, it becomes important that is the society, and this is applicable for the organizations also. In organizations there are the different departments, sections, segments of the group and culture, and therefore all are supposed to develop that particular participation in at their workplace. More participative they will be more fruitful and better organizations, better society will be, better nation will be there. Second is it should not be only once in a time, it is a continuous process, and therefore that has to be the repetition of the learning process that has to be there. Unless and until whatever we have learned we do not repeat it, it will not be long lasting. However, learning itself means that is the once we learn we do not forget, but if we do not exercise for the long time, then the efficiency and effectiveness will not be there. What is important is that is in case of the learning principles, it is very, very important that we are the repetitive in nature, and when we are repetitive in nature, then we definitely we will be able to grow. Whatever we are learning, the criticism of the training, education, learning and development is processes, that is do they have the relevance or not. If they have the relevance, then nothing like that. So, therefore, in that case it becomes very, very important that is the course curriculum designing, the subject making, that is all that the trainer has to be very careful about the identifying the training needs and designing the training programs. And if they are able to make the relevance of their training concepts, training programs to the organization, to the society, that will be more in demand. In the training program, education and development program, the most important point is that is a transference. Transference means that is the whatever is required, are they able to transfer or they are not able to transfer. If whatever learning is there through the education, through the training, through the development, and if we are having that able to transfer that particular knowledge, that will be the best output of that particular training program or that particular concept implementation or development of the society is there. Unless and until the transparency is not there, then there will be no use of this particular process, learning process. Finally is there, that is the learning, as I mentioned, is a continuous process. So unless and until there is not a feedback, then definitely we will not be able to understand that is the what sort of the requirement was there and that has been fulfilled, the requirement of the trainees or not. Now there are the finally in this particular module I will like to conclude. Before concluding, I would like to take this concept, that is there are different types of learners: warrior, sage, sleeper and adventurous. Here the emergent score is, that is the low and high, and it is a plant, low and high is there. So therefore if it is the emergent and plant is low and low, it is a sleeper, it is self explanatory, or it is the emergent is high and the plant is low, it is adventurer. If the learner is the plant is high but the emergent is low, he is a warrior, and it is sage. So the so I would like to conclude with these definitions. Who is the sleepers? Sleepers are who show little initiatives or the response to their experiences. Like if you remember in the module 1, I have shown the slide in which the values, attitude, the person is sleeping, right. So therefore he will be the sleeper. Sleeper means they are not taking initiative and not responding to their experiences, and therefore there is no gain. There are the warriors who plan their experiences but tend not to learn from them, right. So therefore they are going through the different experiences, they come across different experiences, but they are not learning from them. The adventurers, that is those who respond to and learn from the opportunities, right. They tend to come their way but tend not to create opportunities for themselves. So therefore they are not making their own efforts, but whatever that comes to in their way, then definitely they are making the avail their opportunity and learn from the opportunities. But unfortunate part is they do not create their own opportunities. And finally sages who both plan and learn from their experiences, and therefore in case of that is their emergent also high and their plant is also high, and this type of the learners, they are the best learners. I am sure that those who have opted for this particular program of TOT, they comes under the sages, those who have both plan and learn from their experiences, and they will learn out of this particular module also. So this is all about the particular module 4, and I end here. Thank you.